Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I'm Rebecca Bellinger, the Executive Director of the Center for Global Business here at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland, College Park. And on behalf of the team here, we are pleased to be hosting you all virtually, at any rate, at our second annual forum. The annual forum is typically the final in-person event of our Thought Leadership Speaker Series held on College Park's campus. We are delighted that our speakers and you, our audience, have been able to join us today via WebEx during these really extraordinary times. And as noted on the slide before you that you should see on your screen, this event is being recorded. The theme of this year's forum, again, as you can see on the slide, is the relationship between global trade and climate change. We have 4 expert voices to share their thoughts with us on this topic today. But first, I'd like to say a few things about the center itself. This way, I'll take up a little bit of time as some stragglers join the webinar because we have over 200 people registered today, and we're really excited about that great audience. So about the center, we are the hub of global learning at the Smith School. A key component of our mission is to provide opportunities for the Smith School community, alumni, the Maryland business community, to gain global mindset and international business skills. We are one of only 15 schools nationwide have been awarded a Title VI grant known as CIBE, or the Centers for International Business Education, through the Title VI Fulbright-Hays program managed by the U.S. Department of Education. And it is this Title VI CIBE grant that is making today's event possible. And if you like what we're doing here today and you enjoy today's webinar, I encourage you all to follow us on Twitter at Smith Global Biz, and that's B-I-Z, to hear more about some of our other upcoming events, including 2 that I'll mention today. First, we have a webinar series that we bring to you in partnership with the Map It Alliance that's geared toward companies in Maryland that are seeking new tools and training to be successful in the global marketplace. And the second thing I'll mention is the virtual Global Marketing Internship Program that we have just launched today, and you are among the very first to hear about it. It's aimed at matching Maryland companies with Maryland Smith talent for website globalization and other digital marketing support. So if you are a student with marketing skills or a Maryland business interested in participating, please do email us at global@rhsmith.umd.edu. I think I would be remiss if I did not point out a few tips for being successful in participating in today's webinar via WebEx. And I know we're all used to Zoom and GoToMeeting and some other things. So about WebEx, we will be using the Q&A function to allow you, our audience, to ask questions of the panelists. You're welcome to post questions throughout the event, and they will be addressed at the end of today's talk. The chat function has been disabled for today's event. Once I do turn it over to the speakers, we recommend that you change your screen view in the upper right-hand corner to the grid view, is what it's called, so that you can see all 4 speakers simultaneously throughout the event. And when the webinar concludes, you will see a pop-up window with a link to the event evaluation. And I do implore you to please spend just a couple of minutes filling out this evaluation for us. It will go a really long way in making sure that we're doing these webinars right in the foreseeable future. And finally, I do have to mention again, per Maryland law, that we are recording this event. And for anyone who wants to see it again, it will be available via our website in about 72 hours. So now, what you all have been waiting for, our speakers. So Kislaya Prasad is the academic director of the center, and together we are joined by Paul Brenton, Alice Hill, and Robert Orr. So I will introduce them all very briefly in turn. If you're interested in finding more about them, finding out more about them, reading their full bios, you are welcome to go to the event website or maybe find them on LinkedIn. But I won't spend too much more time talking here, and I want to get right to our topic. So Paul Brenton is the lead economist in the Macroeconomics, Trade, and Investment Global Practice at the World Bank. His work focuses on trade and regional integration, and he recently co-authored the joint World Bank WTO report on the role of trade in ending poverty. He also serves as Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Trade Policy Unit at the Center for European Studies in Brussels. So thank you, Paul, for being here. Alice Hill is Senior Fellow for Climate Change Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Her work focuses on the risks, Consequences and Responses Associated with Climate Change. She previously served as a special assistant to President Barack Obama and Senior Director for Resilience Policy on the National Security Council staff. She also has a new book out called Building a Resilient Tomorrow, which was published just a few months ago by Oxford University Press. So thank you, Alice, for being with us today.
Thank you.
And Robert Orr is Dean and Professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland and serves simultaneously as UN Under-Secretary General and Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on Climate Change. He has previously served in other really key leadership roles, including at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, the Council on Foreign Relations, and with the U.S. delegation to the UN. And I will also mention he is an esteemed board member here at the Center for Global Business. So Bob, thank you as well for joining us.
Great.
And again, their full bios can be seen on our website. Last but not least, again, I will introduce our moderator for the event, the Academic Director of the Center, Research Professor here at Maryland Smith, and my personal friend, Kislaya Prasad. Kislaya, take it away.
Thank you, Rebecca. So I'll wait till we get to the format. All right, let me get started. So first of all, it's fantastic to see such a wonderful audience. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here. Before we begin, I do want to recognize some special distinguished guests. So I want to thank the interim Dean, Ritu Agarwal, Senior Associate Dean, Mike Ball, and then another one of our board members, Assistant Secretary for the Maryland Department of Commerce, Signa Pringle, Finance Professor and Department Chair, Russ Wermers, and Bob Brammer, who's the CEO of Brammer Technologies and a devoted alum. I'm sure there are many other distinguished people in the group, and I thank you all for being here. And of course, thanks to all of our students. So you may wonder that about us hosting this event in the shadows of what is a completely different global crisis that we are going through, COVID-19. And we did give that some thought, but we decided for a number of reasons to proceed with this event. The first one of those, the first reason was that we thought there might be a little bit of fatigue with COVID-19. And you might be ready for a reprieve. Of course, the reprieve is global climate change, which is arguably a more serious crisis than even the one that we're going through right now. But there's a second reason that there's an unfortunate tendency to postpone talking about climate change in light of something else urgent that's right there right now. And the wolf at the door right now is COVID-19. But that isn't a good reason to neglect climate change. Climate change is a little bit more like the termites at the door, and while that's not a great rallying cry, arguably termites working relentlessly in the foundations can do a whole lot more damage than the proverbial wolf. And then a third reason is that even as early as we are in our current crisis, I have a sense that there's a lot that we might learn, both in terms of things to do and things not to do when we think about tackling the climate crisis. So for all of these reasons, we thought it was a good idea to go ahead. So moving on to today's topic on global trade and the coming climate disruption. I think we've been reminded by our current COVID-19 crisis of how interdependent the world has become, how supply chains extend the world over and are easily disrupted by global events, which makes today's topic, I think, very timely. So let me lay out the plan for today. What we want to do is start by talking about, start with a summary of the state of affairs. What the prognosis is, the degree of urgency that we might or should feel about climate change, and the background topics. After that, we'll talk about the link between global trade and climate change. So I think the link goes in both directions. global trade is a contributor to climate change. You can think of you can think of greenhouse gas emissions because of global trade, for instance. But there's also a link in the other direction. Coming climate disruptions are likely to disrupt global trade, and also environmental policies have an effect on global trade. And finally, I think we'll want to talk about what is to be done and how do we act now to prevent or mitigate the worst consequences of climate change, and then how do we adapt to it. So with that, let me turn to the questioning of our panelists, and I'll direct the first one of my questions to Dean Orr. So to you, Bob, would you tell us something about where we stand today? I mean, what the current state of knowledge about climate change is, and maybe speak even to the urgency and the window of opportunity that we have.
Thank you, Kislaya, and it's wonderful to be here with you today. As much as I am tired of talking about COVID-19, the fact that I was hungry to come and talk with an audience about climate change says a lot about where we are today. The fact is, we know a lot about climate change. There was a time when people could argue that we don't really know where this is headed, we don't know what's happening, and therefore we can't make big decisions. That time is long past. The scientific consensus of the world community and the political consensus has been for some time that we are on a path towards catastrophic climate change. The agreed goal for the global community is to try to reduce emissions such that we can keep the global mean temperature to no more than 2 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels, with the actual goal being 1.5 degrees. How are we doing on that? Not so well. We have already caused approximately a 1 degree of warming, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And we're on a pathway that will take us into the catastrophic range really quite soon. If we are to get on the pathway to limit to the 2 degree goal that is agreed, we would need to strip 15 gigatons of emissions out of our annual emissions by 2030. Just to give a context, that is the equivalent of the full annual emissions of China and the US combined. So we'd need to strip out our 2 largest sources of emissions, the 2 largest emitting countries, by 2030 to get onto the 2 degree path. And if we're to get to the 1.5 degree path that all scientists and political leaders have agreed is far preferable, we would need to reduce more than double that amount of emissions. So why does this all matter, these gigatons and how many degrees? Just 3 facts I'd like to share with you to think about. The numbers of people affected here over the coming decades is extraordinary. The International Office of Migration has predicted that by 2050, we're looking at somewhere between 25 million to 1 billion people living as environmental refugees, having to uproot and move to another country. If we look at the United States, by that same time, by 2050, on current trends, we are looking at doubling the number of days that Americans will experience extreme heat, over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That obviously affects agriculture, it affects all kinds of, it affects mortality, many dimensions of our lives. But the last effect that I'd like to leave with you is sea level rise, which many people think of as some distant future and someone else. If we stay on the current path, we will see sea level rise that will endanger hundreds of millions and potentially billions of people. But even if we get onto the 2-degree path, by the year 2100, 360 million people who live on land today would be inundated. And this is in cities that you all know the names of: New York, London, Mumbai, Dhaka, Tokyo, and go down the list of major metropolitan areas. That's by 2100, and we're talking a large percentage of humanity. So this is not theoretical, it's happening now. But if you look at the trend lines, getting onto the below 2-degree path is absolutely essential, and it's easier to do sooner rather than later.
Thanks, Bob. Alice, if I may turn to you, I wonder if you'd give us some explicit examples of how industries and communities are being impacted even now, and realistically, what will the future impact be in the very near term?
Well, thank you. I'm really delighted to have this chance to join with you today. You don't have to look far to find examples of climate disasters. In fact, here in the United States, NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, every year publishes a chart that shows how many billion-dollar events the United States has suffered. They've been doing this since 1980, and that chart just soars upward year after year almost in terms of the number. And then you can look across at the underlying map of where those occur. Those events, of course, stretch from coast to coast. California wildfires, and we can even look prospectively for this year. We have an unfolding catastrophic risk, COVID-19, that's keeping people at home. As Bob has mentioned, climate change will tend to push people out of their homes because of the nature of the events. But just this year, we're about to hit hurricane season. That'll begin June 1st. NOAA has predicted a stronger than ever hurricane season. Not than ever, a stronger hurricane season. This spring, 23 states face more extreme flooding because of more precipitation. And then when we get a little further west and a little further in the year, we will see that California will have a higher wildfire risk because they've had rains and they're having an extraordinarily dry conditions which fuel the fires. So you can go to the rest of the map of the globe: Australia suffering fires, flooding in Europe. Pretty much everywhere has suffered terrible events. India, extreme heat. And as Bob has mentioned, we'll probably see far greater deaths from heat because that is one of the most certain effects of climate change. And we know that extreme heat events will become more intense with greater climate change. The way these play out in the market, it was illustrated in 2011 when at the beginning of the monsoon season, Bangkok suffered some extraordinary rains, and those rains flooded out industrial parks, about 800 companies. About half of those were owned by the Japanese, and that had a material effect on the bottom line of the major automobile manufacturers in Japan. They lost production of about 400,000 cars, $2.8 billion in losses, simply because those small industrial parks and those companies located there produced parts for cars that were essential. You couldn't create the car without the part. And the kinds of disruptions that we've seen after Puerto Rico, when Maria swept through and blew out the entire grid, that meant that certain medical supplies were delayed. It turned out that we had concentrated production of medical supplies in Puerto Rico. As these events continue to unfold, we'll see greater and greater threats and pressures on communities across the world. The truth is that even if we cut our emissions today, and of course some people have pointed to the fact that COVID-19 is cutting our emissions, the prediction is that they will immediately rebound once economies are trying to get back on their feet. But even if we cut emissions to zero today, for the foreseeable decades, we would suffer the impacts of climate change: worsening sea level rise, worsening heat, and the more intense storms, wildfires, and extreme precipitation events that follow. And the reason for that is we have baked in heating just because of the delay in the atmosphere. Once the emissions are released, it takes a while before the heating to occur, and that heat will cause us to suffer more damage. The need is urgent to cut our emissions. That is the most resilient strategy we have, but it's also very urgent that we take steps to prepare ourselves now. As the COVID-19 has shown, if we don't prepare, it makes things far worse.
Thanks. Before we move on to trade, for either for Bob or you, I wanted to ask you about reversibility. Some people take some comfort in the fact that technologies as yet unknown might help with the might help to reverse some of the damage we've done. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe Bob, if you might.
Sure. In terms of reversibility of the climate system, there's very little we can do to undo the damage we've already done. But there are huge investments being made in things like carbon capture, use, and storage that if they were able to get to scale and become economically viable, could change the equation significantly to be able to store and use carbon in ways. There are some current experiments going on in the marketplace as well as in laboratories to extract CO2 from the atmosphere and use it. That could make a dent, but still not at large scale. I think the broader point about reversibility is that some people have argued that maybe we've reached the point it's time for geoengineering and that we need to start lining the seabed with lead and do dramatic things to try to change the Earth's ecosystem. Not only are these proposed interventions extremely risky, none of them have borne scrutiny of any kind of scientific process that would give hope that the various geoengineering solutions are anywhere near around the corner. So I'm afraid there's no silver bullet out there that we can see at this point.
Thanks. Paul, I'll turn to you next and ask you to talk a little bit about the relationship between trade and climate change. In particular, do policies that promote trade and globalization of supply chains lead to increased greenhouse gas emissions? And then also in the other direction, do policies to protect the environment impede trade?
Great, thanks very much. And it's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. There are traditionally three ways in which trade is seen to affect carbon emissions. Through a scale effect, a composition effect, and a technology effect. Globalization clearly increases production. It increases the amount of goods and services that are available, but that also entails the need for more energy, more transportation to move goods around the world. But we all like more goods and services, so that's the positive of globalization. Trade and globalization also affect the composition of what we produce and where it's produced. And traditionally, trade economists argue that trade opening allows countries to specialize according to their comparative advantages, what they can produce best, and we see resources moving to where they're most efficiently used. Now, that assumes away all other distortions, for example, environmental distortions. And so again, that change in the composition of trade could lead to increased global greenhouse emissions. One big concern a lot of people share is that where some countries may introduce regulations to limit emissions, that those industries, those activities may move to other countries where those regulations are much weaker and then export back to the original country. So this sort of pollution haven hypothesis. There's not a lot of support for that, but that is a concern about how trade opening can increase emissions. There's also challenges around governance and how we manage things like forests and other factors that are important in the whole global environmental situation. So in countries where governance is weak, trade may lead to the misuse of resources such as forests and land, and that is a key issue when we think about how to open up the way that trade affects the environment. Trade policies are also important. It's interesting, I think, to note that US trade policies, for example, US tariffs are much lower on dirty, what we might call dirty products that have higher greenhouse emissions than they are on cleaner products. Overall, in the world economy, we tax cleaner products much more heavily than we do dirty products. There's a reason for that, and that's because typically industries want to get their inputs at a cheaper rate, and they want to have the outputs that they produce taxed more heavily. So that's why the US, for example, tax finished products much more heavily than they do the inputs that are used in those industries. A recent study has calculated that if clean industries were taxed in the same way from a trade point of view as dirty industries, if we had the same policies on both, then global carbon emissions could reduce by 7% a year. So even on trade policies, there are steps that can be taken. Finally, there's the issue of technology, and trade is a conduit for technology, so that trade increases the availability of goods and services that can reduce emissions. Think of solar panels, think of electric cars, etc. And finally, and I think something that we'll come back to, is that trade increases incomes, and as incomes go up, we typically see the demand for higher environmental standards increasing as well. So I think we'll get to the whole issue of trade and development and the role of that. Overall, the evidence suggests that the scale effect of globalization is more important, has dominated than those other two effects up to now. So that overall trade has increased global carbon emissions. That doesn't mean that reducing trade is the answer, because trade in some ways is part of the solution. And I think that's something we can discuss later on in the discussion. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Now, I'll ask you also to talk about the fact that climate change is blamed for a lot of the extreme weather events that Alice was talking about earlier, flooding, wildfires, etc. And what do we know about how these are anticipated to affect global trade?
Well, they're happening already. It's got a little bit lost in the news, but a real crisis in East Africa is the swarm of locusts that's moving across the continent, which is associated with climate change. The climate change has improved the conditions by which such swarms can breed and spread. Last year, we had a major cyclone in Mozambique, which has caused huge devastation, again, related to climate change. So these things are happening already. They're massively disrupting trade, and it's the developing countries which are the least able to bear those costs. So yes, trade is fundamentally affected by climate change because it affects what the comparative advantage that countries have. So again, a lot of developing countries are very much dependent on agriculture, and agricultural productivity is going to be hit hard by climate change, by rising temperatures and changing precipitation. One particular product that may be relevant for this discussion or for this audience is that I saw last week that climate change is going to have a big impact on productivity of barley, and that there could be shortages of beer as we move forward. But that's one example. For some countries, climate change is going to be catastrophic. Malawi, for example, is a major exporter. It's dependent on production of maize. And maize is going to become, the production of maize, Malawi will be hard hit by climate change and could reduce incomes in Malawi by up to 80% if there's no adaptation. So this is catastrophe in the extreme. Again, extreme weather effects affect the infrastructure that's necessary for trade routes, ports, etc. So yes, climate change will have a fundamental effect on trade, And so again, these relationships between trade and climate change are quite complex.
So my next question is related. I'll pose this to Bob, related to what you were talking about happening in Africa. Global trade has been lauded as the most effective poverty reduction tool ever created. And do you believe that the goals of fighting climate change and fighting global poverty are in opposition to one another, or is it possibly to have it both ways?
Indeed, not only are they not in opposition to each other, I would even go so far as to say the fight against climate change is one of the biggest poverty reduction tools out there. And vice versa, the attempts to reduce poverty do not automatically mean increased climate change. Let me just walk through a couple of the numbers. I think a fairly recent World Bank study that, in fact, Paul may be the author of, I should have checked who was the author on this one, did estimate that if we don't account for climate-informed development approaches, 100 million more people will be living in extreme poverty by 2030. Just 10 years from now, 100 million more people if we don't adopt climate-informed policy. Likewise, the OECD has estimated that climate impacts at our current rate will cause about a 2% drag on the global annual GDP, this by about 2060. So going both ways, you see massive impacts from poverty to climate change and climate change to poverty. The one thing that I'd like to focus on here, though, is that reducing poverty does not necessarily mean more climate change. The old analyses were if you take an American-style middle-income lifestyle and export that to China and India, climate change will be runaway. Obviously, lifestyle choices are a huge part of managing climate change and its effects. Not everyone needs to have, should have, or aspire to what we consider an American lifestyle today. In fact, one of the very big surprises of the Sustainable Development Goal process development at the UN in 2015 was that sustainable consumption made it through the process as well as sustainable production. We all need to look at our lifestyle choices, how much carbon we're burning through travel, through what we wear, through what we eat, through how we insulate our homes or not. Obviously, we need to aggregate improved lifestyle choices. And the beauty of poverty reduction is as people get more resources, they are proving to invest in better lifestyle choices. Not everyone goes for the Big Macs. And we do need to really focus on those lifestyle choices, both for the moral imperative of reducing poverty, but also for the imperative of reducing climate change.
Thank you. So the choices bring me to my next question. This will be for Alice. So turning to the question of what is to be done about climate change. So do you in your mind have a clear picture of what the need for the hour is, and where do we need to get to as a society and an economy, and how do we get there?
Well, I hope that we take this terrible lesson from COVID-19 and learn that the lack of preparation and focus on catastrophic risk can lead to shutting down the economy and many more surprises than most people were anticipating, if you ever anticipate a surprise. I think we need global action to cut emissions. My work focuses on resilience. The cutting emissions, in my opinion, largely must come from top down. We can all cut our own consumption of energy and make a difference, but it will not make a material difference in the outcome of the rising temperatures and further warming. But we can make a difference if we, in the bottom-up approach of insisting on resilience and then marrying resilience considerations with mitigation considerations. Neither of those latter two programs are really in place. The state of adaptation around the world is poor. The Global Adaptation Commission, which issued its report in 2019 with Ban Ki-moon and Bill Gates as co-chairs, stated that we needed a revolution in planning and preparedness for adaptation. We simply aren't prepared. Our consensus-based fourth national climate assessment, which is congressionally mandated and is based on the consensus of the 300-some experts who work on the report, said that basically adaptation is not yet occurring in the United States. What is occurring is very disjointed and tends to be ad hoc. So we need to get serious about considering the risks that will be not in 2100. It's unfortunate that folks have focused on the modeling that talked a lot about 2100. These events are unfolding now. They will worsen, if not year over year, but certainly every few years. And we just have not internalized yet that the extremes of today will not be the extremes of tomorrow. It will get worse. But yet we continue to assume that our climate is stationary, that is, that it operates within the boundaries that we've enjoyed for approximately at least the last 8,000 years, but longer, possibly longer. And we assume that that will occur, and it will not be the case going forward. We are seeing change occur at a pace never experienced, and certainly in human history. And of course, all our built systems rely on this assumption that the climate is stable. So we need to understand that building to what has occurred in the past will not keep us safe in the future. What we absolutely have to do, and this is John Holdren, President Obama's, I credit him with this, we must avoid the unmanageable. That means we have to mitigate our emissions, but we also have to manage what is now the unavoidable. And those are the impacts that are occurring now and will continue to occur for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Paul, turning to you. Well, I was going to ask you whether we can get the benefits of trade in a climate-friendly way, and I think both Bob and you have answered that to some extent. So maybe I'll ask you, when you think of policies to combat climate change, first, is there any trade-off to be made at all? And if so, how should we be making it?
Sorry, who was that question to? Was that to me?
To Paul, yes.
Yes, okay, all right, thanks very much. Well, maybe just a couple of points I can make. I think one thing is to point out that sort of increasing trade with developing countries would not necessarily increase emissions. And I think we need to dispel some of those myths. Just as an example, Ethiopia has invested heavily in generation of electricity from hydro. There's some other environmental consequences of building dams on the Nile, but in principle, all of Ethiopia's electricity will come from hydro, and it will export hydropower to the rest of East Africa. Ethiopia's also invested heavily in a railway, so most of its trade will be transported in and out of the country by railway, which is a low emissions mode of transportation. The challenge for Ethiopia is a development one, because a lot of firms still have to use generators because they're not connected to a grid that can access that electricity. But in principle, a lot of developing countries will be low emission sources of production, and that's one of the advantages, and we have to allow them to exploit those advantages through trade. And I think then we would also get the poverty impacts of that. So I think we do need to coordinate climate change and trade policies. I think there's a first step that we can take very quickly is to remove trade policies that distort towards emission-intensive products. And that's something that can be done very quickly. I think often the climate change, the measures to reduce emissions, certainly in developing countries, are ones that lead to improved technologies, more efficient technologies, and that again is conducive with trade and development. I think the conclusion from a lot of what we're experiencing at the moment and how to deal with future crises from the trade front is the need for cooperative solutions. The cooperative solutions are superior to countries pursuing solutions on their own. And so coordinating these trade policy and climate change policies is going to lead to better solutions than if all these countries are going alone.
Thank you. So, Bob, it would appear that things have slowed down on the multilateral front. So my question to you would be, how much of what needs to be done can be achieved by domestic policy alone? And in your view, what are the most pressing policy priorities?
Thank you. I think the biggest levers for mitigating climate change and for adapting to the impacts of climate change remain in the hands of national governments around the world. So domestic policy is key. The big levers being regulation, tax policy, research and development policy, infrastructure investments. These are the big levers that move the gigatons. But as we've seen with President Trump's attempt to remove the U.S. from the Paris Agreement framework, subnational actors at the state level and the local level can make an appreciable impact on emissions reduction. And this is truly visible in the United States. While we are not on a Paris compliant path, we have maintained at least some parallel trajectory to a Paris compliant path because of the commitments of governors, mayors, county executives, and the like. That said, the multilateral system is essential to achieve the goals of climate mitigation and adaptation. This is a global good, and the danger of free riders is always present. If major actors like the US or Brazil or Australia absent themselves from the system, it gives cover to those who don't want to make the tough decisions in their own countries. So while we have not seen yet the exodus from the global multilateral agreement that was feared after President Trump tried to undermine it, we do have to constantly reinforce that multilateral agreement and system that we have. There is a third element I would put in here, Kislaya, and that is the climate action that comes through business and finance that is not necessarily directly dependent on national or multilateral action. It clearly has feedback effects, positive and negative, when you get good or bad regulation, good or bad tax policy. But there are a lot of economic actors out there doing what they think is good for their shareholders or for their own interests. And I think we do need to increasingly wrap them into the international regime. So it's not just a multilateral regime, but it's a multi-stakeholder regime as well. And here the investment community is huge. Mark Carney has been brilliant as the governor of the Central Bank of England, and now working with us at the UN on climate finance. Things like the disclosure, changing the disclosure regulations has caused really a revolution in boardrooms around the world. And if we keep pushing on this, internalizing the impact of transparency, and if you can see where the money's going, and if it's causing climate change or if it's helping mitigate climate change, we have seen pretty large flows move. So we need to keep pushing on that transparency piece so we can involve increasingly this third set of actors that is neither national decision makers nor international decision makers.
Thank you. On policy, I do want to make sure we have enough time for questions, but on a couple of things. On policy, Alice, if I might ask you, how would you assess the impact of the Trump administration on both the domestic and international front when it comes to climate change?
I would say on the international front, it's been devastating. I agree with Bob that our removal from the Paris Agreement has signaled that the U.S. does not intend to lead in this area. And it gives cover to those who may not have been as excited about a voluntary agreement, which was what the Paris Agreement is. So I think that that was a horrific message, really, for the world and its fight to cut emissions. We have seen cities across the United States and some states step forward to say that they will be still in the fight, and that is to be applauded. But this is, as Bob said, the cutting emissions has to be, in my opinion, driven by national policy. The Trump administration has eviscerated our policy. Even in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Trump administration announced further rollbacks of our fossil fuel emission standards. There are many fights happening in courtrooms to stop what the Trump administration has put into motion. But it will take time if there is a change in leadership this fall, or when change in leadership and direction does occur, to put back in place what was there, as well as to have the added ambition that we need as we continue to heat up. Similarly, on the adaptation front, the Trump administration has basically removed from almost all strategic documents that guide the federal government, including those that guide our security agencies, the military, Homeland Security, and as well our Federal Emergency Management Administration, removed the mention of climate change. Now, that doesn't mean that the Trump administration has stopped trying to reduce risk from natural hazards. In fact, it has devoted more money to that endeavor than the Obama administration or really any other administration had on a systematic level working with Congress, and they are to be applauded for that. But there's a great danger when we neglect to talk about climate change. If you're going to invest in infrastructure or you're going to invest in a long-term project and you don't consider whether either the buildings or the land that you're choosing, or even how the operation is conducted, if you don't consider what the future impacts of climate change are, those investments are at great risk. And that is not occurring on a systemic basis in the United States or across the world. The World Bank has made major efforts. USAID has actually, for the U.S., under the Obama administration, established some requirements that are still in place for our international investments, but we are anywhere near where we need to be. It should be that before we make any investment, whether it's in a coastal city or an inland city, we decide, or a rural area, we decide and determine whether that investment is resilient to the future impacts of climate change, which will occur during the life of the investment. But that doesn't happen. And Bob is correct that in the private sector, it's happening to some extent, but it's still on a voluntary basis. And I think, frankly, that the disclosures we've seen to date, we see that some companies don't want to be first in line because they're afraid it would undermine their economic competitiveness to reveal what risks they face from climate change. So not to have a push occurring for regulation in this space means that we require on the goodwill of leaders. Larry Fink from BlackRock has stated that climate risk is investment risk. But until we see really true disclosure on this, most investors are operating in the dark. The Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures, a voluntary group established to look at this issue and establish metrics that companies can measure themselves by, it did a recent survey that found only 4% of the companies surveyed, 1,100 companies, were actually disclosing in accordance with the scheme that they recommended. So we have a ways to go. Unfortunately, we continue to heat up as we're waiting for us to respond.
Well, thank you. So I'll pose an exit question to anyone who wants to take it, or all of you, before we turn it over to audience questions. So what, if anything, does this short span of the COVID-19 crisis that we've seen teach us about responding to the climate crisis, or the climate challenge that is coming our way? Whoever wants to take it, or all of you could as well.
Well, I can start. I think one of the major lessons that will come out of this, and of course there'll be some kind of commission or investigatory committee set up by Congress that will look at what went wrong. And they're going to make a finding, as they've made in so many investigations of catastrophic events, that there was a failure of imagination. That was the major finding of the 9/11 Commission. That was the most serious failure, they said. Simply, we couldn't imagine planes being flown into the World Trade Center and elsewhere in the United States. Similarly, for Pearl Harbor, Americans couldn't imagine an attack on their soil by the Japanese. Katrina, we couldn't imagine a hurricane of that level. And President Trump, in the beginning days and earlier this year, was saying, who would have thought? Of course, we have ways to help us exercise that imagination, scenario planning, requiring disclosure. We need to make sure that we are continually forcing people to look at the risks. But because of the way the human brain is constructed, our optimism bias, or that we tend to think bad things won't happen, as well as our availability bias. If it hasn't happened, we assume in our memory, or to someone we know's memory, then we assume it's not going to happen. And that tends to make us deeply discount what the risks are. And of course, we've seen that with COVID-19. Many experts have predicted that this would occur. It was merely a question of when, not if. And that's certainly the same thing with climate change.
I'll just jump in here to say the biggest takeaway for me has been, when you face a systemic challenge like COVID-19 or like climate change, you need a cohesive response that crosses political divides. The kind of dissension we see now of liberate Texas, liberate Michigan on COVID-19 undermines the very fundamentals of a collective response that is required to address the challenge. But we've seen exactly that dynamic in the climate space as well. When one set of actors eats away at the foundation of a collective response, it has a deleterious effect in causing others to do the same. And so I think if there's one thing that we could come out of the COVID-19 crisis clear on, it's that in this country, we cannot afford partisan responses to crises that transcend party politics. And that means in the climate space, when we are rebuilding from this crisis, we need to make investments that acknowledges the real risks that we know from climate change and the real opportunities in the economic transition ahead. Easier said than done, but I think if ever a case has been made that partisanship has no place in such a crisis, the COVID-19 response, we're living through it now, but I think makes the case eloquently. We need to apply that kind of a nonpartisan response and joint efforts when we get back to business on climate change.
If I may, just on trade, I think we're going to see a re-evaluation of global value chains. Clearly, this crisis has shown that they're very vulnerable to disruption. And the just-in-time model that dominates a number of global value chains, and whether that is sustainable. And that, in a sense, what I think will be incorporated in some cases into including climate resilience into these value chains. And what we need to see is how that's actually going to affect where activities are located and what that implies for emissions. Whether we're going to get large-scale reshoring, as some people think, I think we don't know. We'll wait and see. I think we'll get more diversification in value chains so that we'll get more sourcing, sourcing from more places, which might have actually implications for greater transportation, more warehousing costs, etc. But I think these are things that people are thinking through on how these value chains become more resilient to these risks and what that actually implies. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's turn to some questions. So I have here, one for Paul. If we enable low-income East African producers to work smarter, such as developing their own ownership over IP, such as Ethiopia has done for coffee, will the strategy help to mitigate some of the horrors of climate change? This is from Meg Brindle.
Yeah, well, I think we're increasingly we'll see low-income countries that are developing develop more products, and they will want to protect the property that they develop. I think in coffee, what we'll increasingly see, or what we would like to see, is moves into greater processing. So one of the challenges, I think, and this gets back a little bit to the way that products are taxed, is that we see a lot of the processing of raw materials taking place a long way away from where those raw materials come from. And that clearly has emission implications. So all the coffee essentially is processed in the US and the EU, and it's all grown in developing countries. Now, climate considerations, emission considerations would suggest that the processing of heavy products should take place closer to where they're produced. So I think in the longer term, we'll see more and more of these sort of activities moving closer to where the raw materials are in developing countries. So Rwanda is quite a nice example, which has managed to brand its coffee perhaps even better than Ethiopia. And maintaining the intellectual property on Lake Kivu coffee, for example, is a critical part of that strategy.
So I have a question here from Robert Brammer. What impact do you believe will come from the activities of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures? Would anyone like to take that?
I think, as Alice mentioned, compliance with the voluntary regime of climate-related disclosure has been very low. But there is a real discussion, or has been a real discussion prior to the current pandemic, about moving to a more mandatory disclosure regime. And certainly Europe has been looking at this very seriously. If you start talking about taking the lessons from the voluntary disclosure regime and how it has been beneficial to the companies that have disclosed more, and that the marketplace and the flow of investment has rewarded them. It lowers the risk profile for those businesses. If that is learned and applied much more broadly, and I think the only way to really get to scale is through mandatory disclosure. There are 14 different, more than governments, it's EU plus 13 other governments that have had serious discussions about potentially adopting a common mandatory disclosure framework. And this includes some of the biggest economies in the world that include China and India, as well as countries like the EU and Canada. So moving into the mandatory disclosure regime could really change fundamentals here.
Could I just add one thing? I agree, and I think Europe has led this. Mark Carney, when he was the head of the Bank of England, suggested scenario testing. Another area where we may see more pressure on boards to consider actively climate risk is through the litigation system. I was formerly a judge, and I believe that the fiduciary duty that boards hold to their companies, it will become a point, at a point where the failure to look at certainly climate risks to their own operations, their own supply chains, what's going to happen to them, will be, that will be a breach. And once there's greater knowledge of the fact that these impacts are coming, they will be more extreme, and that planning should be in place to mitigate those risks, we will see greater action. So we haven't seen here in the United States, we've seen a couple of cases suing Exxon for failure to prepare their own facilities. Australia has been a little bit more forthcoming about predicting future liability, but I think that will be an area that we'll see greater activity in conjunction with the pressure to make public the disclosures through the task force.
And I think this will have to be the last, the one more question, that this will be the last one from Michael Ball. How much of a negative impact will the current policies emerging from Brazil have, and what are the prospects for developing countries to take strong actions to address climate change? So would anybody like to talk about Brazil in particular and anything that stems from what is happening there?
I'll take a first whack at that, and in this regard, I'm speaking as an academic and not as a UN official. The policies pursued in Brazil have been nothing short of disastrous, and I think Brazil has played a very constructive role over many years on climate policy in helping to work with other major emerging economies to move towards a energy mix that is more reliant on renewables, to deal with increasingly better forest practices until recently. So I think turning things around in Brazil is actually quite important to stabilizing the constructive movement we have seen in the so-called BRICS. Brazil, well, the key developing country and emerging market economies. Now, instead of being one of the leaders in the group of large emerging economies, Brazil is the laggard. So getting it turned around has broader international implications, not just for its own emissions profile.
So I would just, if I could add that I think the wildfire policies that President Bolsonaro and his administration have pursued, according to scientific evidence, did increase the emissions, and once we see more of that rainforest burn, there are consequences for the entire globe. So the choices made there do matter, and they may matter more than other areas of the world.
We have lots of questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to have the time to address them. So I do apologize to anybody whose question I haven't been able to get to. Thank you so much for submitting the questions. I will end by thanking our panelists for making this possible. I know you were very patient with all the changes we had to do to change the format and everything. I thank you a lot. We usually have little gifts, center memorabilia and things like that, but we will get it to you by mail at a time when it is safe to do so. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Yeah.